Chapter 5.3 5.3 Intercultural Communication. It is through intercultural communication that we come to create, understand, and transform culture and identity. Intercultural communication is communication between people with differing cultural identities. One reason we should study intercultural communication is to foster greater self-awareness. 163 Judith N. Martinet and Thomas K. Nakayama, Intercultural Communication in Contexts, 5th edi. Boston, Massachusetts, McGraw-Hill, 2010. 4. Our thought process regarding culture is often other-focused, meaning that the culture of the other person or group is what stands out in our perception. However, the old adage, know thyself, is appropriate, as we become more aware of our own culture by better understanding other cultures and perspectives. Intercultural communication can allow us to step outside of our comfortable, usual frame of reference and see our culture through a different lens. Additionally, as we become more self-aware, we may also become more ethical communicators as we challenge our ethnocentrism or our tendency to view our own culture as superior to other cultures. As was noted earlier, difference matters, and studying intercultural communication can help us better negotiate our changing world. Changing economies and technologies intersect with culture in meaningful ways. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Intercultural Communication in Contexts, 5th ed. Boston, Massachusetts, McGraw-Hill, 2010. 1721. As was noted earlier, technology has created for some a global village where vast distances are now much shorter due to new technology that make travel and communication more accessible and convenient. Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Message. New York, Bantam Books, 1967. However, as the following Getting Plugged In box indicates, there is also a digital divide, which refers to the unequal access to technology and related skills that exists in much of the world. People in most fields will be more successful if they are prepared to work in a globalized world. Obviously, the global market sets up the need to have intercultural competence for employees who travel between locations of a multinational corporation. Perhaps less obvious may be the need for teachers to work with students who do not speak English as their first language, and for police officers, lawyers, managers, and medical personnel to be able to work with people who have various cultural identities. Getting plugged in the digital divide. Many people who are now college age struggle to imagine a time without cell phones and the internet. As digital natives, it is probably also surprising to realize the number of people who do not have access to certain technologies. The digital divide was a term that initially referred to gaps in access to computers. The term expanded to include access to the internet since it exploded onto the technology scene and is now connected to virtually all computing. Alexander Van Dorsen and Jan van Dijk, Internet Skills and the Digital Divide, New Media and Society 13-06, 2010, 893. Approximately 2 billion people around the world now access the internet regularly, and those who don't face several disadvantages. Patricia Smith, The Digital Divide. New York Times Upfront, May 9, 2011, 6. Discussions of the digital divide are now turning more specifically to high-speed internet access, and the discussion is moving beyond the physical access divide to include the skills divide, the economic opportunity divide, and the democratic divide. From an international perspective, the United States is falling behind other countries in terms of access to high-speed internet. South Korea, Japan, Sweden, and Germany now all have faster average connection speeds than the United States. Patricia Smith, The Digital Divide. New York Times Upfront, May 9, 2011, 6. And Finland, in 2010, became the first country in the world to declare that all its citizens have a legal right to broadband internet access. Diana Ben Aaron, Bringing Broadband to Finland's Book Docs. Bloomberg Businessweek, July 19, 2010, 42. People in rural areas in the United States are especially disconnected from broadband service, with about 11 million rural Americans unable to get the service at home. As so much of our daily lives go online, it puts those who aren't connected at a disadvantage. From paying bills online, to interacting with government services, to applying for jobs, to taking online college classes, to researching and participating in political and social causes, the Internet connects to education, money, and politics. Intercultural communication, a dialectical approach. Intercultural communication is complicated, messy, and at times contradictory. Therefore, it isn't always easy to conceptualize or study. Taking a dialectical approach allows us to capture the dynamism of intercultural communication. A dialectic is a relationship between two opposing concepts that constantly push and pull one another. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Intercultural Communication in Contexts, 5th ed. Boston, Massachusetts, McGraw-Hill, 2010, 73. To put it another way, thinking dialectically helps us realize that our experiences often occur in between two different phenomena. This perspective is especially useful for interpersonal and intercultural communication, because when we think dialectically, we think relationally. This means we look at the relationship between aspects of intercultural communication rather than viewing them in isolation. Intercultural communication occurs as a dynamic in-betweenness that, while connected to the individuals in an encounter, goes beyond the individuals, creating something unique. Holding a dialectical perspective may be challenging for some Westerners, as it asks us to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously, which goes against much of what we are taught in our formal education. Thinking dialectically helps us see the complexity in culture and identity, because it doesn't allow for dichotomies. Dichotomies are dualistic ways of thinking that highlight opposites, reducing the ability to see gradations that exist in between concepts. Dichotomies such as good/evil, wrong, right, objective, subjective, male-female, in-group/out-group, black-white, and so on form the basis of much of our thoughts on ethics, culture, and general philosophy. But this isn't the only way of thinking. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Thinking Dialectically About Culture and Communication. Communication Theory 9 No. 1, 1999, 14. Many Eastern cultures acknowledge that the world isn't dualistic. Rather, they accept as part of their reality that things that seem opposite are actually interdependent and complement each other. I argue that a dialectical approach is useful in studying intercultural communication because it gets us out of our comfortable and familiar ways of thinking, since so much of understanding culture and identity is understanding ourselves. Having an unfamiliar lens through which to view culture can offer us insights that our familiar lenses will not. Specifically, we can better understand intercultural communication by examining 6 dialectics. See Figure 5.7. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Thinking Dialectically About Culture and Communication. Communication Theory 9, Number 1, 1999, 125. The cultural individual dialectic captures the interplay between patterned behaviors learned from a cultural group and individual behaviors that may be variations on or counter to those of the larger culture. This dialectic is useful because it helps us account for exceptions to cultural norms. For example, earlier we learned that the United States is said to be a low-context culture, which means that we value verbal communication as our primary, meaning-rich form of communication. Conversely, Japan is said to be a high-context culture, which means they often look for nonverbal clues like tone, silence, or what is not said for meaning. However, you can find people in the United States who intentionally put much meaning into how they say things, perhaps because they are not as comfortable speaking directly what's on their mind. We often do this in situations where we may hurt someone's feelings or damage a relationship. Does that mean we come from a high-context culture? Does the Japanese man who speaks more than is socially acceptable come from a low-context culture? The answer to both questions is no. Neither the behaviors of a small percentage of individuals nor occasional situational choices constitute a cultural pattern. The personal contextual dialectic highlights the connection between our personal patterns of and preferences for communicating and how various contexts influence the personal. In some cases, our communication patterns and preferences will stay the same across many contexts. In other cases, a context shift may lead us to alter our communication and adapt. For example, an American businesswoman may prefer to communicate with her employees in an informal and laid-back manner. When she is promoted to manage a department in her company's office in Malaysia, she may again prefer to communicate with her new Malaysian employees the same way she did with those in the United States. In the United States, we know that there are some accepted norms that communication in work contexts is more formal than in personal contexts. However, we also know that individual managers often adapt these expectations to suit their own personal tastes. This type of managerial discretion would likely not go over as well in Malaysia, where there is a greater emphasis put on power distance. Geert Hofstede, Cultures and Organizations, Softwares of the Mind, London, McGraw-Hill, 1991, 26. So while the American manager may not know to adapt to the new context unless she has a high degree of intercultural communication competence, Malaysian managers would realize that this is an instance where the context likely influences communication more than personal preferences. The differences-similarities dialectic allows us to examine how we are simultaneously similar to and different from others. As was noted earlier, it's easy to fall into a view of intercultural communication as other-oriented and set up dichotomies between us and them. When we overfocus on differences, we can end up polarizing groups that actually have things in common. When we overfocus on similarities, we essentialize or overlook important variations within a group. The static dynamic dialectic suggests that culture and communication change over time, yet often appear to be and are experienced as stable. Although it is true that our cultural beliefs and practices are rooted in the past, we have already discussed how cultural categories that most of us assume to be stable, like race and gender, have changed dramatically in just the past 50 years. Some cultural values remain relatively consistent over time, which allows us to make some generalizations about a culture. For example, cultures have different orientations to time. The Chinese have a longer-term orientation to time than do Europeans. Myron W. Lustig and Jolene Quister, Intercultural Competence, Interpersonal Communication Across Cultures, 2nd ed. Boston, Massachusetts, Pearson, 2006, 128-29. This is evidenced in something that dates back as far as astrology. The Chinese zodiac is done annually, the year of the monkey, etc., while European astrology was organized by month, Taurus, etc. While this cultural orientation to time has been around for generations, as China becomes more westernized in terms of technology, business, and commerce, it could also adopt some views on time that are more short-term. The history/past-present/future dialectic reminds us to understand that while current cultural conditions are important, and that our actions now will inevitably affect our future, those conditions are not without a history. We always view history through the lens of the present, the privileges, disadvantages. Dialectic captures the complex interrelation of unearned systemic advantages and disadvantages that operate among our various identities. As was discussed earlier, our society consists of dominant and non-dominant groups. Our cultures and identities have certain privileges and/or disadvantages. Because our identities are complex, no one is completely privileged and no one is completely disadvantaged. As these dialectics reiterate, culture and communication are complex systems that intersect with and diverge from many contexts. A better understanding of all these dialectics helps us be more critical thinkers and competent communicators in a changing world. Intercultural communication and relationships. Intercultural relationships are formed between people with different cultural identities and include friends, romantic partners, family, and coworkers. Intercultural relationships have benefits and drawbacks. Some of the benefits include increasing cultural knowledge, challenging previously held stereotypes, and learning new skills. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Intercultural Communication in Contexts, 5th ed. Boston, Massachusetts, McGraw-Hill, 2010, 383. For example, I learned about the Vietnamese New Year celebration Tet from a friend I made in graduate school. This same friend also taught me how to make some delicious Vietnamese foods that I continue to cook today. I likely would not have gained this cultural knowledge or skill without the benefits of my intercultural friendship. Intercultural relationships also present challenges, however. The dialectics discussed earlier affect our intercultural relationships. The similarities, differences, dialectic in particular, may present challenges to relationship formation. Judith N. Martin and Thomas K. Nakayama, Intercultural Communication in Context, 5th ed., Boston, Massachusetts, McGraw-Hill, 2010, 384-87. While differences between people's cultural identities may be obvious, it takes some effort to uncover commonalities that can form the basis of a relationship. Perceived differences in general also create anxiety and uncertainty that is not as present in intracultural relationships. Once some similarities are found, the tension within the dialectic begins to balance out and uncertainty and anxiety lessen. Negative stereotypes may also hinder progress toward relational development, especially if the individuals are not open to adjusting their pre-existing beliefs. Intercultural relationships may also take more work to nurture and maintain. The benefit of increased cultural awareness is often achieved because the relational partners explain their cultures to each other. This type of explaining requires time, effort, and patience, and may be an extra burden that some are not willing to carry. Last, engaging in intercultural relationships can lead to questioning or even backlash from one's own group. While these challenges range from mild inconveniences to more serious repercussions, they are important to be aware of. As noted earlier, intercultural relationships can take many forms. The focus of this section is on friendships and romantic relationships, but much of the following discussion can be extended to other relationship types. Intercultural friendships. Even within the United States, views of friendship vary based on cultural identities. Research on friendship has shown that Latinos value relational support and positive feedback. Asian Americans emphasize exchanges of ideas, like offering feedback or asking for guidance. African Americans value respect and mutual acceptance, and European Americans value recognition of each other as individuals. Mary Jane Collar, Communication Competence Problematics in Ethnic Friendships. Communication Monographs 63, Number 4, 1996, 324-25. Despite the differences in emphasis, research also shows that the overall definition of a close friend is similar across cultures. A close friend is thought of as someone who is helpful and non-judgmental, who you enjoy spending time with but can also be independent, and who shares similar interests and personality traits. Pei-Wen Lee, Bridging Cultures, Understanding the Construction of Relational Identity in Intercultural Friendships, Journal of Intercultural Communication Research, 35, Number 1, 2006. 11. Intercultural friendship formation may face challenges that other friendships do not. Prior intercultural experience and overcoming language barriers increase the likelihood of intercultural friendship formation. Patricia M. Cias, Jolanta A. Derzuica, Mary Mears, Rhiannon Bent, Yoko Konomi, Maria Ortega, and Colleen White. Intercultural Friendship Development. Communication Reports 21, Number 1, 2008, 9, Doye 10, 1080-8934, 2107, 01643750. In some cases, previous intercultural experience, like studying abroad in college or living in a diverse place, may motivate someone to pursue intercultural friendships once they are no longer in that context. When friendships cross nationality, it may be necessary to invest more time in common understanding due to language barriers. With sufficient motivation and language skills, communication exchanges through self-disclosure can then further relational formation. Research has shown that individuals from different countries in intercultural friendships differ in terms of the topics and depth of self-disclosure, but that, as the friendship progresses, self-disclosure increases in depth and breadth. Ye-Wen Chen and Masato Nakazawa, Influences of Culture on Self-Disclosure, as relationally situated in intercultural and interracial friendships from a social penetration perspective. Journal of Intercultural Communication Research, 38 Number 2, 2009, 94. Further, as people overcome initial challenges to initiating an intercultural friendship, and move toward mutual self-disclosure, the relationship becomes more intimate, which helps friends work through and move beyond their cultural differences to focus on maintaining their relationship. In this sense, intercultural friendships can be just as strong and enduring as other friendships. Pei-Wen Lee, Bridging Cultures, Understanding the Construction of Relational Identity in Intercultural Friendships, Journal of Intercultural Communication Research, 35, Number 1, 2006. 6. The potential for broadening one's perspective and learning more about cultural identities is not always balanced, however. In some instances, members of a dominant culture may be more interested in sharing their culture with their intercultural friend than they are in learning about their friend's culture, which illustrates how context and power influence friendships. Pei-Wen Lee, Bridging Cultures, Understanding the Construction of Relational Identity in Intercultural Friendships, Journal of Intercultural Communication Research, 35 Number 1, 2006, 19. A research study found a similar power dynamic, as European Americans in intercultural friendships stated they were open to exploring everyone's culture, but also communicated that culture wasn't a big part of their intercultural friendships, as they just saw their friends as people. As the researcher states, these types of responses may demonstrate that it is easiest for the group with the most socioeconomic and sociocultural power to ignore the rules, assume they have the power as individuals to change the rules, or assume that no rules exist since others are adapting to them rather than vice versa. Mary Jane Collier, Communication Competence, Problematics in Ethnic Friendships, Communication Monograph 63, No. 4, 1996, 332. Again, intercultural friendships illustrate the complexity of culture and the importance of remaining mindful of your communication and the context in which it occurs. Culture and romantic relationships. Romantic relationships are influenced by society and culture, and still today some people face discrimination based on who they love. Specifically, sexual orientation and race affect societal views of romantic relationships. While interracial relationships have occurred throughout history, there have been more historical taboos in the United States regarding relationships between African Americans and white people than other racial groups. Anti-miscegenation laws were common in states and made it illegal for people of different racial ethnic groups to marry. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Loving versus Virginia, declaring these laws to be unconstitutional. Robert A. Pratt, Crossing the Color Line, A Historical Assessment and Personal Narrative of Loving v. Virginia. Howard Law Journal, 41, No. 2, 1995, 229-36. It wasn't until 1998 and 2000, however, that South Carolina and Alabama removed such language from their state constitutions. Loving Day, The Last Laws to Go. Loving Day, org. Accessed October 11, 2011. Even after these changes, there were more Asian white and Latino/A white relationships than there were African American white relationships. Stanley O. Gaines Jr. and Kelly A. Brennan, Establishing and Maintaining Satisfaction in Multicultural Relationships, in Close Romantic Relationships, Maintenance and Enhancement, eds. John Harvey and Amy Wenzel, Mahwah, New Jersey, Lawrence Earlbaum, 2011, 239. Having already discussed the importance of similarity and attraction to mates, it's important to note that partners in an interracial relationship, although culturally different, tend to be similar in occupation and income. This can likely be explained by the situational influences on our relationship formation we discussed earlier, namely, that work tends to be a starting ground for many of our relationships, and we usually work with people who have similar backgrounds to us. There has been much research on interracial couples that counters the popular notion that partners may be less satisfied in their relationships due to cultural differences. In fact, relational satisfaction isn't significantly different for interracial partners, although the challenges they may face in finding acceptance from other people could lead to stressors that are not as strong for intracultural partners. Stanley O. Gaines Jr. and Kelly A. Brennan, Establishing and Maintaining Satisfaction in Multicultural Relationships, in Close Romantic Relationships, Maintenance and Enhancement, eds. John Harvey and Amy Wenzel. Mahwah, New Jersey. Lawrence Earlbaum, 2011. 241. Although partners in interracial relationships certainly face challenges, there are positives. For example, some mention that they've experienced personal growth by learning about their partner's cultural background, which helps them gain alternative perspectives.